Hello, and welcome again to T2RL Talks. And today we're going to be talking about how the airline industry in general, and airlines in particular, can respond to the current crisis that's been prompted by military operations in the Middle East. And I don't think we'll go into the politics of that at all, just to note some of the impacts on the industry. And to discuss that, I have a very familiar voice on these podcasts, which is Bert Craven, head of our technology practice and deputy CEO of T2RL, and a podcast debutante, my good friend and colleague Jane Atkinson, who is our senior vice president of business development, who works with airlines around the world. So, hi Bert, hi Jane.
Hi Ian, great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So, we've posited that there is a crisis developing in the airline industry, and for some airlines like Spirit, for example, it has already well and truly developed, and that crisis has been caused by the current military actions in the Middle East that have led to the closure of the Straits of Hormuz and a reduction in the supply of petroleum products. But they've also contributed to a drop in demand for air transport services. And I noticed that IATA has just said that air travel demand dropped by about 3.5% in April this year compared to previous years. So the crisis is real. And in a way, the airline industry is accustomed to dealing with crises that have external sources. And we can all think back to, well, those of us old enough can think back to 9/11, but also the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. We can think of COVID, so we're used to dealing with external influences. But I would suggest that this crisis is fairly unusual in that it's affecting both cost and demand. It's pushed up jet fuel prices. They more or less doubled in the immediate aftermath of the first raids on Iran. They've fallen back a little since then, but it's also suppressing demand. So I don't think the industry's had to face a crisis on both fronts for a very long time. Bert, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's always a bit of a pinch at both ends, but this does seem to be marked. I mean, 3.5%. That will be the net. I mean, we'll have seen shift of demand from certain routes into other routes and from certain regions into other regions, but a net drop of 3.5% is not something that's necessarily easy to absorb. And also, if there is a disinclination to travel, it's not necessarily something that can be solved by simply lowering price either.
No, that's right. I mean, I remember in the aftermath of 9/11, I remember some of the airlines made really big price discounts in an attempt to regenerate demand. That's going to be much more difficult to do this time around because costs have gone up by 20% as a figure to pluck from the air. So yeah. This really is very difficult. Jane, in your conversations with airlines around the world, is this top of mind at the moment? Are airlines getting very concerned about this, or are they just kind of assuming this will pass like all other crises?
Yeah, well, it seems that there is an obvious cost pressure for all airlines with fuel costs increasing considerably. But what I'm finding is that they're trying to kind of keep calm and carry on. There will still be the contract renewals that they have to consider, and there will be time constraints. And T2RL, I always try to talk to airlines in good time, well in advance of all of that. But there should be other ways. We can try and find other ways for them to start reducing their costs to try and combat the increase in fuel costs, which we hope will in time get back to normal. But in the short term, airlines are looking at things to do, over and above the stuff that they've got to do every day.
Yeah. So most airline costs are pretty inelastic. The cost of fuel is set on global markets. The cost of owning aircraft is set in long-term lease or purchase agreements. The cost of employing people is reasonably inelastic. There's some room for maneuver there, of course, with temporary staff and da. Yep. So even though the costs of things like technology, distribution, communication services are a smaller part of the whole, they are at least ones where there is some scope for addressing them. And I think that's where we come in our conversations with airlines and our endeavors to help airlines with those contracts.
Yeah, and within a reasonable amount of shift, there are fixed costs and there are variable costs. So a lot of technology and distribution services are based on volume of sales, volumes of passengers boarded or segments booked or whatever it might be. So when those fall, the associated costs will fall in line up to a point. But there are also significant fixed costs that don't necessarily adjust with changes in demand or changes in volume. And go ahead.
Sorry, I was about to comment on something you said there, which is about the variability of some of those costs. We have certainly seen contracts that include contractual minima for those costs, where the costs don't fall nicely in line with.
They don't. I mean, the minima should, even where people are paying minimums, unless they've signed a very poor contract and have what we call walking minimums, where basically the minimums are adjusting every year, and there's very little headroom between last year's actuals and this year's minimums. The minimums have got your growth built in and all of those kinds of things. A reduction in demand, unless it's sort of severe, shouldn't bring you too close to your minimums. But in some cases, it may do, depending on how you've been impacted. And then, with things like fuel cost, you've got, traditional sort of LCC and network carriers where fuel may be 25% of their cost. And then you'll have LCCs and ULCCs where fuel may be 30 and above 30% of their total cost. So there's a much greater exposure to changes in those costs in some types of carriers. And also the margins will tend to be different in those airlines as well. And so they are more susceptible to both change, what we talked about, pinches at both ends, so changes in demand at the top and changes in cost of supply at the bottom.
Okay, so maybe we could just think of a few examples where we have been able to work with airlines, and obviously we're not going to be naming names here because those discussions are all subject to various confidentiality agreements, but just as examples, some of the areas where there may be cost reductions available, either by renegotiating contracts or sometimes just by selecting options that already exist within the contracts and are not fully used. One I would immediately throw in would be the cost of messaging. Messaging has been quite a high cost item for a lot of airlines, and in 2026 there are alternatives available to bring those costs down, and I think we have worked with some airlines that have been able to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things about those traditional kind of aviation messaging standards is the contracts for them and the use of them has been very, very long established. I mean, the contracts may date back 10 years or more. They're often, in some carriers, there are very few people who actually understand the utilization and what drives the cost in those things. They're just a kind of a regular bill that comes in every month. And the relationship between the consumption and the cost is not necessarily well understood. And certainly it's been an area in the past where, through analysis of the patterns of messaging, we've been able to identify very significant savings. I think a lot of airlines, when we've spoken to them and done the analysis, have actually been very surprised about, first of all, how much they were paying to begin with, and also how much of that messaging could be done at a much lower cost. So there's definitely scope in things like Type B messaging, ACARS messaging, those kinds of things. And it's not an area that is often looked at or re-examined by airlines. It's just assumed to be an ongoing sunk cost.
Yeah, and I think it's not just contractual provisions that have pitfalls. I remember one of the very earliest contracts we ever worked on at T2RL was with an airline in Europe that was using an external fare quote service, and they were being charged by the transaction, and we were able to look at their utilization of their architecture and realize that they were actually submitting lots more requests to the external service than were actually justified, and every one of them was billable. And we were able to suggest really quite a small tweak in the way their setup worked, and saved them about 70% on their external cost. Now, I can't say we will always be able to achieve such stellar results, but those things do happen.
Yeah, and I think because of the work that we do for carriers, we spend a lot of time building cost models and doing analysis of cost patterns and helping expose the relationship between consumption and cost, and looking at areas of optionality and different clauses within the contract that might provide greater flexibility than the airline believes it actually has. And it's surprising how often there are exactly those kinds of scenarios where actually, airlines talk about costs being hidden. They're just complex. You can find them if you go and look for them. And I think one of the things about crises like this is it does suddenly bring focus on cost. It brings in a huge amount of additional cost discipline. And while a lot of that goes in terms of things like going forward, airlines, canceling projects or removing as much third-party cost as they can, it also needs to be retrospective. So looking back into the contract portfolio and saying, well, where do we think there might be buried treasure within the existing portfolio of contracts that could be renegotiated or modified in some way to give us immediate benefit in terms of cost base?
Yeah. I think as well, though, Bert, when I'm talking to airlines, and this is the kind of thing I'm talking to them about, you might be able to find some hidden gems and we might be able to help you reduce costs. They'll say, well, where do we start? So you have this portfolio of contracts, and there are many. So, where would we start? So Ian had suggested before, yes, maybe type B messaging is one of the hanging fruit. But where else might you suggest we look? That's the kind of question I'll get.
Yeah, I think there are always things that are worth looking into by basically building models. I mean, there are unlikely to be very obvious unnecessary costs. I mean, though it's the unobvious ones. So, for instance, distribution modeling, looking at the total cost of distribution in terms of what you're paying for payment processing, what you're paying in marketing, what you're paying in distribution fees, what you're paying incentives, and building a model of the distribution network that allows you to understand where you're distributing efficiently and where you're not. Looking at your distribution contracts, there are a lot of airlines out there who have freedoms within their distribution contracts that they sort of believe they should have on principle, but when you actually look at whether or not they're using them and they're paying a premium for these freedoms, they're not actually really differentiating content. They're not actually doing anything that justifies paying significant additional distribution charges. So I think those kinds of analyses will nearly always yield savings, which can, in a lot of cases, are immediate. I mean, then it's not something that you have to go and do that takes a long time to implement. One of the challenges for airlines is that quite often it takes money to save money. So when you're trying to make things more efficient and you're trying to reorganize your delivery network, or you're trying to reorganize your crew rostering, or you're trying to reorganize anything in order to save money, the actual savings can be months and months away because of the work that needs to be done. Whereas quite often money that's hidden in contracts and hidden in payments that you're making, really, it doesn't take much more than identifying it and having a quick conversation with the provider to get to the savings.
And that's something that we've worked on quite a bit in the last few years, really, in our distribution forensics service, where we can take a very deep dive into all of the data around distribution, the different channels, the mix, the commissions, all the rest of it,
Yeah.
And I think we quite often find that things that airlines believe to be true about their distribution costs are not 100% correct, and that there are some hidden either additional costs or even hidden potential for savings that the airlines themselves haven't considered because they've always done it this way. And you know, what else are we going to do? Well, there are possibly some other things.
Yeah, there's a lot of what we call anecdata, which flows around airlines, which is sort of information that's become almost mythological and is passed on. And there's a belief about where cost lies and where inefficiency lies, that actually when you go and get the real data, which nearly every airline has somewhere, it's a question of breaking down a few silos and building some models that make it transparent. It can be extremely revealing.
Yeah, and that's an important point. Sometimes the data is always there. The data is always there somewhere, but how accessible it is and how easy it is to aggregate some of the different data sources and bring them together, that's trickier, and that's something that, you know, we've been working on for, well, the last decade, really.
Yeah, and you know, we have to do this all the time when on a contract by contract basis. So whenever T2RL are negotiating contracts, we're building cost forecasts over 5 or 10 years of the total cost of ownership of systems, in order to drive out what airlines talk of as hidden costs. In reality, what they are is actually costs that are very difficult to foresee. But you know, there are a number of mechanisms that we've developed over the years about controlling those costs, and also controlling those costs in a crisis. So for many years, you know, T2RL contracts have had language in them that relate to what we call a material change of business, i.e., we all accept that demand is stochastic. We all accept that there is seasonality in demand. But what if there's a really significant change in demand? These things like what we call a material change of business clause is basically a pre-agreement between a provider and an airline that in the event that something significant happens within the airline's business model, that there is some pre-agreed remedy that gives the airline some relief. And so these kinds of provisions are very important. Certainly during COVID, you know, which was probably the last time that lots of airlines found themselves with their minimums biting, there were a lot of negotiations around what should happen to those minimums. And obviously airlines who already had contractual provisions, those conversations were much quicker and much simpler than airlines who had to sort of start from a position of actually there was no obligation for their provider to do anything at all in such circumstances.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, and you know, the subject matter for this conversation is what can airlines do in a crisis. But I think we also have to keep in mind that a lot of the suppliers to the airline industry will be subject to some of the same impacts when you have a crisis like this. And you know, we look back to COVID, and that certainly impacted some of the vendors. So it's really incumbent on us that the assistance we give is based on a certain measure of equity. We can't go around driving the suppliers out of business. That would be counterproductive for all concerned.
Yeah, and we have to bear in mind that the vendors, you know, particularly vendors who are airline industry specialists, where basically all of their customers are airlines, are exposed to the same kinds of changes in the airline market, not in the same way, but the exposure is there. So if their revenue is linked to airline bookings, then changes in volumes of airline bookings will affect their revenue, which is why so many of them have been so keen to have things like minima in their contracts historically, because they need to have a given proportion of guaranteed revenue to cover their costs. I think over the years, that has shifted, where vendors have been trying to protect the ROI of the contract rather than just cover their costs. But you know, all of these things come into play when the whole market is being squeezed at the same time.
Yeah, and Jane, you talked about how despite the fact that we're living through a fairly substantial crisis, business as usual has to carry on. And airlines are coming up to contract renewal all the time. There's well over 1,000 airlines in the world, and they've all got contracts of various kinds. So there's a lot of contracts coming up for renewal at any one time. We would like to think that when we come up to a contract renewal, we can help the airlines achieve better contractual terms that will, to some extent, insulate them against future contracts. Is that part of the conversation that you have with airlines?
Absolutely, Ian, but every conversation is different. Every airline model, business model, location, geographical location is different. So it's very, very difficult to compare apples to apples. But what we can say is that every time we work with an airline and we help them achieve a contract with their chosen provider at the end of the process, we have been able to achieve the optimum commercial terms, the optimum capabilities that are available in the market to that airline at that time, for that tier or type of airline, if you like. But we can always say in any renegotiation as well, which we've done many of, that we've achieved a more robust and a long-term, commercially efficient contract than they had before. And we have our conference in September at Engage in London, and we have a few speakers who will attest to that. So it'll be great to see them there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you come to a contract renewal and you go to market, obviously a possibility is that you may want to change your supplier, but equally there's a very strong possibility that a lot of airlines would prefer, which is to stay with their current supplier, but improve the terms and achieve a better result for the airline. And I know that over the last year or so, we've had 2 or 3 examples of airlines that we've worked with who've gone to market at renewal time and ended up staying with their incumbent supplier, but on substantially better terms. Yeah.
No, I mean, the goal, even in a contract renewal, is still a negotiation. There still needs to be a very robust conversation with the supplier. When the renewal of a contract comes up, the airline has a very, very short window of normally quite high leverage. But that goes, the moment the contract is signed, the leverage is gone, and you're now locked in for another 5 years or 10 years or whatever it may be. So that little window of leverage is massively important, and the contract represents the long-term store of that leverage. So you have a short window to apply the leverage. That leverage is expressed in the terms of the contract and in the pricing, and then it's sort of like almost like inflating a balloon very quickly and then letting the air out of it slowly over 10 years, i.e. the contract represents your long-term leverage that you have built up over that very, very short window of negotiations. And so preparing for that well in advance, understanding exactly what it is that you want to achieve in a renegotiation, having really robust long-term cost models for worst case scenarios, sensitivity analysis, all of those kinds of things, are how the airline gets to a sense that it has achieved the best possible value. So having a really strong market benchmark, i.e. either running a fully competed process or having a partner advising you who can give you a sense of, are we achieving a good price in the market here? So benchmarking of contracts is an important aspect of this as well. And the best possible benchmark, of course, is a live competed RFP. That will tell you exactly what the market as a whole is willing to offer your airline at this particular point in time. But building those levers is very important.
Yeah, I think the full competed RFP, I think that's an example of what you were talking about earlier. There is some cost involved in running an RFP like that. And it is an example of having to see that cost as an investment, with the return being the better contractual terms
Yeah.
and the provisions that you have after it.
The cost of an RFP is a rounding error in the savings that will be built into the contract. I mean, it's a rounding error in a rounding error. I mean, it feels big going in at the start, but when you look at the cost model that you've achieved throughout the negotiations, and you're sort of saying, okay, well, our RFP, if we know, even if we load in all of our internal cost of all of the staff who took part and that kind of thing, we're probably well under $500,000. And the savings we've achieved are $60 million over 5 years or something like that. Nobody's ever arguing with those numbers at the end. It's a little bit difficult getting in at the start, but the benefits are undeniable.
Okay, so if we accept that the industry is now facing a significant crisis, which is as significant as the ones around COVID or the global financial crash or 9/11, what should airline IT and business managers be thinking about now in terms of addressing some of those costs? What's their to-do list for addressing those costs?
Well, they can talk to me first of all.
Of course.
Yeah, please reach out and talk to me. And then I'll introduce Bert and a couple of the other consultants, for example, Paul Heber, who's an expert in Type B messaging, and others in our team who are experts in all sorts of different fields. And then talk to the CIOs, CFOs, whoever else wants to talk to us about where they might be able to find these savings. And we can plan some sort of strategy around helping them achieve that.
Yeah. And I think the overall opportunity is in a sort of portfolio rationalization. You have to look holistically. The cadence of contract renewals is always going to drive you. As Jane said, and you mentioned, Ian, there's 1,000 airlines. All of these contracts are expiring all the time, and they need to be renewed or renegotiated or sent out to tender. So that is your natural rhythm of these contracts need to be dealt with. But there is a more holistic view, which is looking at the portfolio as a whole and saying, well, where's the buried treasure? Where's the cost that we could go after here? Where could we rationalize? And this is particularly important because a lot of these contracts reach quite deep into different areas of the supply chain and the cost model for the airline. And the opportunities are always there, but they will be different for every airline depending on their specific set of partners, their specific set of contracts, how old some of those contracts are, how recently they've been negotiated, how soon they may be up for renegotiation in future, and so on. But I mean, our experience is that there is opportunity in every portfolio. And our experience of negotiating these contracts is that we can generally fairly quickly identify the most likely candidates for finding those cost savings.
So I guess in sort of order, first up, you have to identify and accept that, yes, this is actually a crisis. This is actually an area where we need to take some action. And then it's a matter of analysis. You need to know what you're able to achieve and what you're looking to achieve before you start going out and trying to make any actual adjustments. But then that analysis, based on the experience that we've generated over the last 20 years of working with airlines, should not take a huge amount of time. It should be a relatively quick process, and then you can go forward into a plan of action that will start with making use of provisions in the contracts as they now stand in many cases, and then think about where you need to be renegotiating some of the contracts.
Yeah, and I think the reassuring thing is that this is basically no regrets activity. What you should be doing is exactly the same. It's just the urgency that has changed. You need to look at it now, and you need to look at it in a little bit more depth than you might do otherwise. But there's not a situation where you're going to go, oh no, what if we do all this work and actually accidentally save money that we didn't need to? That's not an argument anyone's ever going to make. So, the point is that the savings are there. It's just the urgency of identifying them and acting has changed, I believe.
But also don't stop doing what you're already doing. Don't put your existing plans on hold. There will still be contracts to renew, and you need time to get to that point. So don't put things on hold that are big decisions.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that comes back to something you said right at the beginning of this conversation, Jane. The prevailing mood at the moment is more or less one of keep calm and carry on. There is an assumption that this crisis will pass, and therefore we have to carry on doing the stuff that we were planning to do anyway, our long-term strategies. But at the same time, we do need to acknowledge that for the next few months, at the very least, things are going to be quite sticky.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay, I think that's a pretty good summary of the situation. We just published a short paper on our website, and in fact, it's classified as a first view, which means that it's not behind our paywall. You don't need to be a subscriber to read it. So please, if you're listening to this and you're interested in what we've had to say, download the first view. It's only a couple of pages. It'll only take you 2 minutes to read, and think about what you might want to do to address the current crisis, and maybe how T2RL can help you. As Jane said earlier,
free advice. Yeah. We've already saved you money, and you haven't even called Jane yet.
And as Jane did say earlier, this conversation will absolutely continue at T2RL Engage in September. So if you're an airline in particular, please register and come and join us in London in September. My usual reminder here, there is no charge to airlines for attending T2RL Engage, and we look forward to seeing as many as possible of our listeners at T2RL Engage. And if you are a listener, do come up and say hi at the conference, because it's always good to hear when we're reaching you in far-flung parts of the world. So I'd like to thank Bert. I'd like to thank Jane for the conversation, and I hope it's given you some food for thought. And as always, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again in the next issue of T2RL Talks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.